Australian identity, race relations and immigrations. Indigenous Australians. Australian Aboriginal ancestors arrived in Australia approximately 72,000 years ago. The first extensive investigation into Aboriginal DNA has found that early Australians left Africa somewhere between 51,000 and 72,000 years ago. The study found evidence of a single out-of-Africa event, meaning that they set out on the long march towards Australia virtually straight away, compared to those that would go on to populate Europe. The study proves that there were Aboriginal people with very highly developed cultures in Australia before people ever even got to Europe. It also shows that the first people reached Australia within 10,000 years of leaving Africa. Aboriginals were the first human occupants of Australia, and studies also show that the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians descended from Eurasian populations. They travelled by boats from an offshore island that's now recognised as Indonesia to reach Australia. They are globally recognised as having the longest surviving culture. Convict transportation. From 1788 through to 1868, Britain transported more than 160,000 convicts to Australian colonies, namely due to their overcrowded prisons. These convicts formed the first migration from Europe to Australia, and despite being the first European migrants, there was no available land upon their initial arrival, as they were vastly outnumbered by more than 500,000 Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal identity. Until the mid-1830s, Aboriginals were widely accepted and acknowledged as Australians. Soon after, settlers coined the term Australian to describe themselves. This led to Aboriginals being identified differently between the states of Australia from 1901 through to the 1940s. For example, in Western Australia, an Aboriginal was considered to be any individual with more than a quarter of Aboriginal DNA, whilst in Victoria, an Aboriginal was thought to be any person of Aboriginal descent. Free immigrants. The term free immigrants refers to the individuals who are not convicts, however they still chose to migrate to new Australian colonies. The first fleet of free immigrants, or settlers, arrived on Australian shores in 1793. From there, more than 200,000 free settlers migrated to Australia between 1793 and 1830. Due to the extremely high and ever-rising unemployment and poverty rates in the United Kingdom, the government was actually encouraging this migration to lessen the strain on the UK. The vast majority of these migrants were of Irish and Scottish descent, particularly agricultural workers and domestic servants. Gold Rush. During the 1850s, Australia went into the country's first gold rush, attracting many Chinese and foreign immigrants from all over the world. Initially, convicts were tasked to the digging of the goldfields. However, eventually these convicts were moved elsewhere to open up employment opportunities for Australian immigrants. The mateship that developed between the diggers forms the basis of how we perceive ourselves as Australians, even today. Masses of foreign immigrants rushed to Australia when the gold rush period was well and truly underway, which opened the doors for racism, something that wasn't really prevalent within the current occupants of Australia. In 1861, Chinese immigrants made up 3.3% of the Australian population, the greatest it has ever been. These Chinese were almost all men, and most were under contract to Chinese and foreign businessmen. They worked on the goldfields until their debt was paid off, and most of them returned to China, as shown with the 40,000 arrivals and 36,000 departures between 1852 and 1889. There were campaigns to remove the Chinese from the goldfields, and their motivation was based on racism and the fear of competition, as the Chinese were known as untiring workers. White Australia. Soon after the gold rush, many diverse cultures and individuals began to migrate to Australia, leading the government to bring in the Immigration Restriction Act, created after Federation in 1901. By 1888, more than 70% of the Australian population was born there, bringing about a true sense of national sentiment that still holds relevancy in today's perception of Australian culture. With this nationalism comes an associated racism, which was a real issue for foreigners during this time. The IRA was put in place partly because of this, as well as the want to restrict the economic competition of migrants from Asia and other countries. It was aimed to stop any races other than Europeans from entering Australia, whilst also deporting any undesirables. It was administered by a dictation test and formed the Australian migration system for the next 50 years. This dictation test applied to all non-European people entering Australia between 1901 and 1958. The result of this policy. Between 1901 and 1958, the time the Immigration Restriction Act was in place, Australia identified as being white only. The ideology of this pure white Australian nation stemmed from extremely racist intentions. However, it was viewed as upholding the country's social, moral and political standards. This dramatic act resulted in only a mere 2% of the Australian population in the 1940s being coloured individuals, including the native Australian Aboriginals. Australian citizens believed foreign cultures were tainting their country only strengthened with the introduction of this derogatory act. This white supremacy led to the various government policies ordering the forcible removal of Aboriginal children from their families between 1910 and 1970. This robbing of children was intended to eliminate Aboriginal culture by changing the names of the children, forbidding them to speak their native languages, and adopting them out into white families or sending them to abuse-filled institutions. These generations of children removed under these policies became known as the Stolen Generation. Populate or perish. Post-World War II, Australia improved their immigration program with the introduction of the phrase populate or perish. It was put in place by the government to increase the population of Australia due to the decreased numbers following the war and amid fears that Australia could not defend itself come further tragedy. This policy allowed agreements across the country to accept over 2 million migrants and displaced European citizens. The Immigration Restriction Act was still in place, having not been banished until the 1970s, and therefore Australia still tried to uphold their vastly European population. The government attempted to do this by offering £10 British to the first 1 million British migrants, and they became known as £10 POMs. Boat people. In the late 1970s, a fresh wave of seaborne refugees, predominantly from East Timor and Indochina, sought asylum in Australia. The Vietnamese boat people, as they were dubbed by Australian society, arrived during the time period that Australia was involved with the Vietnam War. This caused Australia to break any ties with Britain or to form new political links with Asia. When the second wave of boat people arrived from Cambodia, Vietnam and China in the late 1980s through to the 1990s, a new concept of multiculturalism arose throughout Australian societies, who were now more accepting of the foreign cultures. The identity of boat people. The term boat people was generally associated with Vietnamese populations, as most of the passengers were from Vietnam. Australia had to accept these refugees in alignment with an agreement made with the United Nations. By 1985, approximately 70,000 refugees from Southeast Asia had settled in Australia. Due to the significant masses of refugees and foreign cultures migrating into Australia, the Immigration Restriction Act, or White Australia policy, was removed. Multiculturalism was now a widely accepted concept, with migrant groups forming associations to maintain their cultures. Asylum seekers. Asylum seekers are distinctly dissimilar from the boat people, as they usually arrive in larger masses organised by smugglers. In more recent years, since the late 1990s, increasing numbers of asylum seekers are fleeing from the Middle East and Sri Lanka. The Migration Act of 1958 states that any asylum seeker to arrive on Australian land without a valid visa must be held in an immigration detention centre until they are either granted a visa or forcibly removed from Australia. I will now play a short video that documents the policy surrounding asylum seekers throughout time.
It's a policy mea culpa that's set to spark civil war for Labor ahead of their national conference this weekend.
I'll act in what I believe to be the best interests of Australia, and that is to have policies which don't lead to criminals encouraging people to get on unsafe boats.
After years of slapping down the government's Turn Back the Boats asylum seeker policy, opposition leader Bill Shorten has taken an epic backflip on the issue, and his colleagues aren't happy.
In my view, it is a cruel and harsh policy.
I'm not in a position to support that policy.
By pushing back boats of asylum seekers, there is a real risk that we could breach international law.
Asylum seeker policy is probably the one issue that has consistently polarised public opinion, divided politicians and left governments around the world struggling to find solutions to deal with the plight of refugees.
The Fraser government took an extremely humanitarian approach. But since that time, immigration and asylum particularly has become an exceptionally politically divisive issue.
Under the leadership of Liberal PM Malcolm Fraser in the late 70s, we had his say yes, say no approach, and saying yes meant the introduction of the first formal refugee policy.
I think Australia's gone backwards.
From 1976 to 1982, the term boat people became a thing, and thanks to Fraser, over 200,000 refugees from Malaysia, Hong Kong and Thailand were resettled in Australia. In 1992, Keating introduced mandatory detention for all people arriving without a visa. 1999 saw people smugglers assisting a massive swarm of asylum seekers coming from the Middle East. In 2001, under Howard's leadership, the Tampa affair brought the biggest shift in immigration policy, prompting the Pacific Solution.
I think the real shift happened in 2001 in the wake of Tampa and then followed by 9/11, really started to link up this idea that asylum seekers could themselves be security threats, and so this securitization discourse began.
Fast forward to 2012, more than 100 boats carrying in excess of 5,000 refugees, mostly from Iraq, Afghanistan and Sri Lanka, arrived in Australia. It was the biggest surge in a decade that saw hundreds killed in failed attempts to reach our shores by boat. In 2013, Abbott came to power with a promise that he'd stop the boats, and he did. There's only been 2 arrivals since the implementation of Operation Sovereign Borders.
In the event that the left of the Labor Party turn the tide on this, then that may be a way for the Labor Party to salvage some of the aspects of the policies that they have for so long derided against.
If I was to form a government, I would want the option of boat turnbacks where safe to do so on the table.
Although many see the debate around asylum seekers as a humanitarian issue, ultimately it's become political. The Liberals saw success off the back of this, and there's strong support from much of the voting public for a strong stance on immigration. At the end of the day, Bill Shorten is gunning for the top job, so it's no surprise he's doing a U-turn on an issue that might get him there.
Race relations and immigration today. Australia is known today as a multicultural country as the result of a tweaked and fine-tuned immigration program that doesn't allow for any discrimination against an immigrant, refugee or otherwise, based on racial grounds. The Racial Discrimination Act remains in place, sending a strong message regarding Australia's commitment to ensuring racial equality. Everyday racism still occurs throughout Australia today, particularly surrounding Muslims and their immigration to Australia and their strong belief systems. Most of the negative racial thoughts that surrounds any culture currently is based on the preconceived beliefs or experiences of that racist individual, rather than the product of a racist environment, as has been the case in previous years.